Welcome back, guys, to Mathatai. We are exploring arguments for the existence of God in this series, and we've already looked at 3 arguments. We looked at the ontological argument, the teleological argument, and the cosmological arguments, and we saw how each one of those contributed to our rational belief in the existence of God. Today we're going to conclude with the 4th argument, the moral argument. And then in our next video, we'll look at the problem of evil, which seems to be the strongest argument against the existence of God, and we'll make some considerations there. So we're glad you've joined us. Let's jump into the moral argument here. Now, C.S. Lewis talked in The Abolition of Man about an embedded moral code in each person. We all have an innate sense of right and wrong. And the question comes, where did that come from? We can have several options for that, and we'll explore some of those. We'll look at where this sense of justice, the sense of morality comes from, and what that can tell us about the existence of God. Now, first of all, before we jump into the argument, I wanted to address the issue of, can we be good without God? Now, this is a 2-part question. It can be seen in 2 different ways. First of all, you can live a morally upright life without the belief in the existence of God. So you could be an atheist and be morally a good person in that sense. So we're not making the argument, and this argument does not seem to claim that unless you believe in God, you can't do good things. So there are plenty of morally upright, upstanding citizens, wonderful people that do not believe in the existence of God. What this argument says is that if God does not exist, can there be morally good and bad, right and wrong things? And so we're looking at the step behind that. Not can we be good? Is belief in God the only way that we can do good things? But can there be good things if there is no God at all? And so we've got to take that one step further back. Now, this is an old argument. It goes all the way back to Plato, who was not necessarily arguing for the existence of God, but he attributed goodness to the ultimate good, capital G, good, which in the New Testament era adopted this Platonic view of the Word, the logos, and attributed that to God. God is that ultimate good, and so all goodness comes from him. And we'll talk about that. But down through the ages, Plato's had a version, Aquinas has had some. The most recent foundational form of this argument comes from William Sorley, who was a professor at Cambridge. And in 1918, he wrote a book called Moral Values and the Idea of God. And he gives a very clear, easy to understand argument here that we'll take just piece by piece. There's only 2 premises and a conclusion. So we'll look at each of these and talk a little bit more in depth about them. His first premise says, if God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. Second premise says objective moral values and duties do exist. The conclusion, therefore, God exists. Now, let's unpack each of these a little bit more. His first premise, if God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. Now, let's make a distinguishment, first of all, between values and duties. When we're talking about value, we're talking about whether something is good or bad for a person. These are things that are beneficial to us or desirable to us. Is it good for us to have a job or not have a job? Well, it's better for us to have a job so that we can earn a living and pay our bills and so on. But is it morally wrong or is it morally inappropriate to have a job or not have a job? There we can't necessarily say. Now we could talk about diligence and laziness and whether those are morally appropriate or not, but having a job is not a moral attribute. And so it's a value. It's better for us to be employed and gainfully employed than to be unemployed and not have financial income. Or we could take it down, many different routes. Is it better for us to drive on the right-hand side of the road or the left-hand side of the road? This is not a moral principle. Those of us who drive on the right-hand side of the road here in the Western Hemisphere in the United States and others are not morally right, while those who drive on the left-hand side of the road, say in many countries in Europe, are morally wrong. These are now values that it's better for us as a society to agree together to all drive on the same side of the road for our purposes. But it's not a moral condition. And so it's good for us, and it would be bad for us to do the opposite. And so those are the values. Now, when we talk about duties, we're talking about something that's right or wrong. You have a duty to act in a certain way. And so it's an obligation that you have to fulfill. You ought to do these things rather than it would be beneficial if you did these things. And so we have a duty to not steal, even though sometimes it would be more beneficial to us to steal. That I would benefit if I took this from you. If my family is starving and I stole some bread, is that morally wrong? And that gets into some slippery slopes. And Immanuel Kant has a lot to say on that, but we won't go into there. Now, let's talk, in addition, between the difference between value and duty. We want to talk about the difference between objective and subjective. Now, an objective category means that it's independent of opinion. So an objective thing is true regardless of opinion or affinity or how you feel about a thing. It's true that 2 + 2 = 4, whether you like it or not. Whether you put that down on your math test or you put a different answer, it's true one way or the other. There is no way around it. That's an objective truth. A subjective truth or a subjective matter is something that's dependent on your opinion. Now, I could say it's better that we drive on the right-hand side of the road than on the left. That's my opinion. I feel more comfortable driving on the right-hand side. When I go places and I drive on the left-hand side of the road, it's awkward and uncomfortable for me, and I'm not very good at it. And so I don't think it's as good as driving on the right-hand side. That's a subjective view that I have. Now, morality cannot be subjective. If we're going to have a universal morality and hold other people to these moral standards, it cannot be subjective. Otherwise, whose subjective morality do we pick to be the better subjective morality? Is mine better than yours? Can I impose mine upon you? And so on. And so these are important considerations when we're talking about the moral argument here. So now we're looking at the moral standard that everybody seems to have, and this will get into our premise 2 in just a moment, but we have a moral standard that we all live by that seems to presuppose the existence of a God, or there needs to be a moral lawgiver in some way. Now, let's talk a little bit more about premise 1, that if God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. So, if God does not exist, then what becomes the foundation of these moral values? Good would have to be based on our circumstance. It would have to be based on our feelings. It would have to be based on something subjective or relative to me. Now, what is good for me is something that's going to benefit me. It would benefit my survival. It would benefit the propagation of my family line. It would benefit the heaping or the amassing of goods and resources for myself. It would benefit something that would make me feel right, would make me satisfied in some way. So it's a very subjective thing because all of us are going to have different things that satisfy us, different things that please us, different things that we desire. And so that can't be the foundation of a universal morality. Now, all of us would say, oh, I think murder is wrong. I think rape is wrong. I think, torturing children for fun was the example we used in our ethics class. I think that's just wrong. But if it's just a subjective feeling that I have, that I don't like it, it doesn't benefit me, it doesn't satisfy my goal, then I have no right to impose that on somebody else. If God is not present, if there's no moral lawgiver, then the moral law comes from my personal subjective viewpoint. And your subjective viewpoint might be different. And who am I to say that it's wrong? And so if God doesn't exist, we have no foundation for our moral values. Now, if they're founded in God, we have duties that exist from that. We ought to do certain things. And now humans are distinct in this because when we look at the animal kingdom, there is no justice there in that sense. We don't look at a lion going out and killing a gazelle and calling it murder. We don't look at the interactions between animals and their natural desires for others as rape or incest or any of those sort of things. That's the animal kingdom. There is no justice in that way. The obligation for a moral behavior isn't present in those animal kingdoms. And so it's arbitrary for us to apply it simply to mankind and not other sources of life if there's not something different. And so we've got to have those rooted in God, and then mankind is unique, being created in the image of God and subject to the obligations that God has imposed upon us that he's not imposed upon the rest of the world. So if God doesn't exist, then there can't be these moral foundations that we are built upon. Now, there is a dilemma here. It's called Euthyphro's dilemma. And he simply asks this question, is something good because God wills it? Or does God will it because it is good? And this is a problem or a dilemma for this reason, because if it's good because God wills it to be good, that seems pretty arbitrary. God could will anything he wants to be good. He could call anything good and it automatically becomes good. So what if God decided murder was good? Does that make it good? So that seems to be an arbitrary standard for what is good and what isn't good simply because God decided that it was good. Now, the second half of this dilemma would say that perhaps God wills it because it's good. So the goodness is intrinsic in the action itself, and God identifies the goodness of the action and calls it good. But that would seem to indicate that morality exists independent of God. So it doesn't stem from God, and God didn't decide what was moral, but morality exists, and God merely identifies it. And so that's a problem. That's the dilemma Euthyphro was trying to point out. Where does this morality come from? But there's a third alternative in this dilemma. It says that the identity of something as either good or bad or right or wrong is grounded in the nature of God himself. So God's nature is the standard of goodness or rightness. His expression, his expressing that action as good is merely an expression of his nature itself. So goodness is bound up in the nature of God himself. God, according to our ontological argument, is the sum of all good. He has the perfect attribute of goodness. He is perfectly good. And so all things that God is are good. And therefore, what is good is simply what is in line with the nature of God. It's not because God declared it to be good, or not that God saw it was good and called it good, but it is God himself, and it's an attribute that God possesses. Therefore, it is good. And so, God can't change his mind. God's not deciding certain things to be good because he would have to change his nature. And the nature of God is perfect goodness. Therefore, whatever God is good. And so, all of these things that he's expressed to us are a reflection or an expression of his nature to us, not his decision of what is good and what isn't good. Now, there's also a moral Platonism that an atheist could come across and say, this is kind of grounded in some of Plato's theories and trying to find morality apart from God. So an atheist could respond and say, well, perhaps these moral laws are simply bare facts. They're self-existent ideas, a lot like things like numbers. They simply exist. And they have no origin. They're just eternal in that sense, or they're self-existent. They're beginningless. But we have a problem here, is that these moral values seem to be relative to people. You know, as we noted before, we don't find these moral values in the animal kingdom. We don't find these moral values in the universal cosmos. We find these only in relation of mankind to one another. And so it seems very relative, and it's hard to imagine these things as abstractions apart from people. Now, 2 plus 2 is always going to be 4, whether there's a person associated with it or not. But murdering somebody is not always immoral, or the killing of some other living entity is not always murder, unless it's a human killing a human. And so there's an arbitrary relativity that it has to be person to person. This only applies to people. These aren't mere abstractions that are universal to all existence. And then also, even if these values do exist, they don't necessarily lead us to duty, to moral duty. Why do I have a duty to act in a certain way? What would impose that duty upon me? Why would these moral laws be imposed upon me, and by whom would they be imposed? And so if they're out there, the universe doesn't have that power to impose the duty upon me. It simply has the power to say that that's what it is. Now, we can look at scientific laws such as gravity. We could say, well, the universe is imposing gravity upon us. It is, but we also have the ability to overcome gravity. Hence, we're able to fly, we're able to send rockets into space, and so on. And so, if these moral laws are simply impositions of the universe, of these abstractions, then we, in theory, would be able to overcome these moral laws and act in a way that would be contrary to them. So again, we're not bound by them. They're not being imposed onto us by an agent per se, but they're just out there, self-existent. Also, finally, in that line, the naturalistic realm would not necessarily produce these finite, definite creatures that correspond to these abstract realities. And so how would we relate to this morality is very difficult to understand, very difficult to see there. Now, humanism, which is the goal that mankind is the center of everything and the growth of the self is really the goal, rejecting God in that sense, has the notion of the greatest good being human flourishing. Our good and our flourishing is the goal, is the ultimate there. So morality is defined as those things that contribute to or benefit human flourishing. Now, this leads to a couple of questions. Why is human flourishing better than the flourishing of other life forms? What is it about human flourishing specifically that makes it better than, say, mouse flourishing? Why shouldn't the horse flourish? Why shouldn't the trees flourish? And so it's an arbitrary association to, again, refine this just to human existence and not to other forms of existence. It's also highly implausible. These non-natural moral qualities are attached to certain actions. So why do these moral laws apply to only certain things? When we look at the gravity on the earth, the gravity applies to everything. It's a universal law on this earth. Gravity applies in all situations. We can overcome that gravity, but here, why do these laws apply only to certain conditions and specificities? And that's something that the natural world would not create. It seems very implausible for that to happen. So the fact that we have these moral principles indicate there has to be a moral lawgiver that imposes these upon us and then requires an obligation for us to fulfill them. So we ought to act out a certain way. It's good to act this way. It's not good to act in these other ways. It's right to do certain things and it's wrong to do other things. And so if we try to deny that, we're in trouble. I mean, we have to find some other foundation for this. Now, premise 2, let's jump into this real quick, says that objective moral values and duties do exist. And this is where a lot of people try to argue this, is that they say they don't exist. But we still have to identify where our morality comes from then. And that becomes a problem. And so we have several objections to this, that moral values and duties do exist. So let's look at a couple of the options and see what is the best option here. First of all, there's a socio-biological issue here, several of these going on. One might argue that these morality, if you will, has been passed on through our genetic material, that we are born with predispositions towards morality. And then they take a second step and would say that we're now having them socially ingrained in us through our families, through education, through the society that we live in. So there's that two-step process that some of our morality is passed on to us genetically speaking. We're born that way. And there's a big movement for that today for genetic predispositions to certain things. And so we can blame our a dependency on certain things or our proclivities towards certain actions on a genetic fault. It's not our fault. We're just built that way. But then, we have a problem with that why is it right or wrong? Who can say it's right or wrong if we're built this certain way? And what about those people that have attributes built into them genetically that we don't like. We won't go there very much more, but we have a hard time discussing some of that. If that's the case, what we're doing is we're not necessarily addressing the truth of moral belief. We're simply addressing the way in which we came about them. We came about this proclivity, we came about this tendency through genetics or through social conditioning, and it doesn't speak whether that is actually true or not, whether it is right or wrong or not. You may be genetically predisposed to act a certain way, but that says nothing about the morality of that action itself. So some of us have had families with alcoholism in the past or different situations in the past, and we are genetically and socially predisposed to act in that way. Yet, we would not say that those are right actions. We have a moral association that we place on the action, even though we may be predisposed towards that. So the way we came about that, or the way we came about the belief, doesn't speak on the truth or the universality of the belief itself. In addition to that, this also assumes that atheism is true. Now, if atheism is true, if there is no God, then moral beliefs are selected by evolution. They're random, they're chance. They're not based on a truth, they're not based on a universal truth, but they're based on the principles of evolution, namely survival of the fittest and mutation. That those mutations that are beneficial towards our survival are the ones that exist. And so there is no true morality other than the one that is progressing us towards survival. And there's no reason to deny our moral experience in that sense. It's a mere survival tactic. And so these are all self-defeating, because if evolution is true, then all of our beliefs have come about through evolution and social conditioning. You only believe what you believe because you were told to believe that and you were predisposed to believe that way. You really aren't free to rationalize and think about them anyways, but you are conditioned into these certain beliefs. And so all of your knowledge is skeptical at that point. All of your knowledge is subject to doubt, because even our knowledge of evolution has been predisposed to us and imposed upon us by society. And so that makes it, is it true, or has it simply been imposed upon us? And so this moral argument tries to go back behind social conditioning, behind any predispositions genetically that we may argue for or against, and it looks at and says, is there a foundation for morality that exists apart from these socio-biological conditions? And if there is, there has to be a lawgiver that imposes those moral values and duties upon us. And we would argue that moral lawgiver is God. All of us know that morality does exist. If, my professor gave me the great example. He says in his class when he was a graduate student, his professor was arguing that there are no universal morals. And so he tried to raise his hand and said, but there are. And the professor wouldn't hear him. So he got up in the middle of class, walked down to the front of the classroom, and kicked the professor in the shin. And the professor hopped around grabbing his shin and said, you can't do that. And he says, why not? I wanted to. It felt good for me. I enjoyed it. Everybody else seems to enjoy it quite a bit. Are you telling me that I'm wrong? Is there a universal law, or is it merely a societal law? Was it wrong for me to kick you, or did we just agree that maybe I shouldn't kick you, and there's really no right or wrong to that? And if there is no universal law in that sense, then there's no universal justice. We can have our localized justice based on our community that we live in, but we can't ultimately say that anybody's right or wrong. You simply disagree with me. And so this moral argument, I feel, is very strong, gives us a great foundation for belief in God, for God as that moral lawgiver, for our obligations to obey and follow and live out that moral law that he has given. We find marriage in every society, so we're not free to just have open relationships so much. We can reject that moral urge, but every society has marriage. Every society has laws and restrictions upon these relationships and how they operate. And these are indicators that there is a universal moral law out there that's imposed upon us by a lawgiver. So thanks for joining us today. Make sure you check out our website, mathatide.org. Like us on Facebook and Instagram. Stop by for future videos. And make sure to like and subscribe. And we'll see you here soon.